Injured rabbit approaches man for help. Their connection will leave you in tears. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wildflowers. The quiet of the early morning was broken only by the soft crunch of boots on the trail. Thomas had always loved these walks through the meadow, a chance to escape the noise of the world and find solace in the simple beauty of nature. He adjusted the strap of the small satchel slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon where the golden light of dawn kissed the tops of the trees. It was a routine he had followed for years, ever since moving to the countryside to find a slower, more peaceful pace of life. But this morning, something was different. As he rounded a bend in the trail, Thomas paused, his ears catching a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping. At first, he dismissed it as the rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant patter of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. But then it came again, clearer this time. A thud, followed by a faint, plaintive whimper. Thomas's brow furrowed as he scanned the area, his senses on high alert. He took a few cautious steps forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and his chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Hello," he called softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. There was no response, only another soft thud. Thomas followed the sound, stepping off the trail and into the tall grass. The meadow stretched out before him, dotted with wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. He moved carefully, parting the grass with his hands as he searched for the source of the noise. And then he saw it. Nestled among the blades of grass was a small rabbit, its brown fur matted with dirt and its tiny body trembling. One of its hind legs was twisted at an odd angle, clearly injured. The rabbit's wide, dark eyes stared up at Thomas, filled with a mixture of fear and pain. Thomas's heart ached at the sight. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle the little creature. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," the rabbit whimpered, its tiny body quivering as it tried to move. But the injured leg gave out beneath it, and it collapsed back onto the ground with a soft cry. Thomas reached into his satchel, pulling out a clean handkerchief. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the frightened animal. "You're hurt," he murmured. "Let me help." He extended the handkerchief slowly, letting it rest on the ground a few inches from the rabbit. The little creature sniffed at it cautiously, its nose twitching. Encouraged, Thomas inched closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe." The rabbit let out a soft chirp, its wide eyes watching him intently. Thomas gently slid the handkerchief under its injured leg, cradling the tiny limb with a tenderness that surprised even him. The rabbit flinched but didn't pull away, its trust seemingly born out of desperation. "You're braver than I thought," Thomas said with a faint smile. Carrying the rabbit back to his cottage was no easy task. Thomas cradled it against his chest, its tiny body trembling with every step. He murmured softly to it as he walked, his words a steady stream of reassurance. By the time he reached the cottage, the sun had fully risen, casting warm light across the wooden walls and stone pathway. Thomas pushed open the door with his shoulder, stepping into the cozy warmth of his home. "All right," he said softly, setting the rabbit down on the table. "Let's see what we can do." He moved quickly but carefully, gathering supplies from the small cabinet in the corner. A bowl of warm water, a clean cloth, and a small splint he had fashioned from a sturdy twig. His hands worked with practiced precision, his years of living in the countryside preparing him for moments like this. The rabbit watched him with wide, unblinking eyes, its tiny body tense but still. Thomas spoke to it as he worked, his voice steady and calming. "This might sting a little," he said, dabbing at the injured leg with the damp cloth. The rabbit flinched but didn't cry out, its trust in him unwavering. "You're a tough one," Thomas murmured, a hint of admiration in his voice. Once the leg was clean, He carefully wrapped it in the handkerchief, securing the splint in place with a strip of cloth. He stepped back to admire his work, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. "There," he said, his smile soft. "Good as new." The rabbit chirped softly, its wide eyes meeting his. In that moment, Thomas felt an unspoken connection, a bond that transcended words. "You're going to be all right," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll take care of you." Over the days that followed, Thomas devoted himself to the rabbit's care. He built a small enclosure near the window, lining it with soft blankets and fresh hay. The rabbit, whom he had named Clover, quickly grew comfortable in its new surroundings. Thomas spent hours sitting by the enclosure, talking to Clover as if it could understand every word. He told it stories of his life before the countryside, of the bustling city he had left behind and the quiet peace he had found here. Clover would listen intently, its wide eyes fixed on him as if absorbing every word. "You're the best company I've had in years," Thomas admitted one evening, his voice tinged with a mix of warmth and sadness. Clover chirped softly, its tiny nose twitching. Thomas chuckled, reaching out to stroke its soft fur. "You've got more heart than most people I've met," he said. As the days turned into weeks, Clover's leg began to heal. The little rabbit grew stronger, its once timid demeanor replaced by a playful curiosity. It would hop around the room, exploring every corner with wide-eyed wonder. Thomas couldn't help but smile as he watched Clover dart across the floor, its small body a blur of energy. "You're unstoppable now, aren't you?" he said with a laugh. Clover chirped in response, its tiny paws skittering against the wooden floor. But as Clover grew stronger, Thomas found himself facing a difficult question. What would happen when Clover was fully healed? Would he keep the rabbit here in the safety of his home? Or would he release it back into the wild, where it truly belonged? The thought weighed heavily on him, the idea of letting Clover go almost too painful to bear. He had grown attached to the little rabbit, its presence filling a void he hadn't realized was there. But deep down, Thomas knew the answer. Clover wasn't meant to stay. As much as Thomas tried to push the thought aside, the question of Clover's future lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he watched the little rabbit hop across the floor or settle into its enclosure for a nap, his chest tightened with a bittersweet ache. Clover was thriving under his care, its fur glossy and its movements more confident with each passing day. But the small, fleeting moments when Clover would pause to stare out the window reminded Thomas of a truth he couldn't ignore. Clover belonged to the wild. One crisp morning, as the golden sunlight streamed through the windows, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of tea in his hands. Clover was nestled on a blanket near his feet, its tiny body rising and falling with the rhythm of its breaths. Thomas watched it with a faint smile, his heart swelling with affection. "You're quite the miracle, you know that?" he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've come so far." Clover stirred at the sound of his voice, its ears twitching as it lifted its head to look at him. Thomas chuckled, setting his mug down as he leaned forward. "You've got a lot of spirit," he continued. "More than I ever gave you credit for." The rabbit chirped softly, its dark eyes meeting his. It was moments like these, simple, quiet, and full of unspoken connection, that made the thought of letting Clover go almost unbearable. But Thomas knew he couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. Clover had healed beautifully, and the time was coming when he would have to make the hardest decision of all. That afternoon, Thomas decided to take Clover outside for the first time since bringing it home. He carried the rabbit in his arms, its tiny body warm and soft against his chest. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the meadow as a gentle breeze rustled the tall grass. Thomas knelt in a patch of clover near the edge of the forest, setting the rabbit down carefully. Clover hesitated for a moment, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Then, with a tentative hop, it ventured into the grass, its tiny paws skimming over the ground. Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and sadness as Clover explored its surroundings. The rabbit's movements were cautious at first, its ears twitching at every sound. But as it grew more comfortable, it began to hop with a playful energy, its small body darting through the grass like a streak of brown and white. "You haven't lost your touch," Thomas said with a faint smile. Clover chirped in response, pausing to glance back at him before continuing its exploration. Thomas leaned back on his hands, his gaze following the rabbit as it disappeared into a cluster of wildflowers. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that this might be the beginning of the end. For a long time, he sat there, letting the warmth of the sun and the gentle hum of the meadow surround him. Clover eventually returned, its tiny frame emerging from the flowers as it hopped back to his side. Thomas reached out to stroke its soft fur, his touch gentle and lingering. "You'll always have a place here," he said softly. No matter what, the days that followed were bittersweet. Thomas began taking Clover outside more often, giving the rabbit the freedom to explore the meadow and reacquaint itself with the world it had come from. At first, Clover stayed close to him, its movements tentative and cautious. But as the days passed, it grew bolder, venturing farther and farther away before returning to his side. Each outing was a reminder of how far Clover had come, and how close they were to the moment Thomas had been dreading. He couldn't keep the rabbit forever. It wasn't fair to Clover, and it wasn't fair to the life it was meant to live. But the thought of saying goodbye filled him with a deep, aching sadness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and gold, Thomas sat on the porch with Clover nestled in his lap. The rabbit's soft fur was warm against his hands, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. "You've changed me," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize how much I needed you until you were here." Clover chirped softly, nuzzling against his hand. Thomas smiled faintly, his fingers stroking the rabbit's fur with a tenderness that spoke of the bond they had built. "I'll never forget you," he continued. No matter what happens, the day Thomas had been dreading finally arrived. It was a bright, sunny morning, the air crisp and filled with the scent of wildflowers. Thomas stood at the edge of the meadow, his heart heavy as he held Clover in his arms. The rabbit seemed to sense the weight of the moment, its tiny body still and quiet against his chest. Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the meadow and the forest beyond. This was where Clover belonged, out here in the wide open world. It was time to let go. "You'll be okay," he said softly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "You're stronger than you think." He knelt down, setting Clover gently on the ground. The rabbit hesitated, its wide eyes meeting his as if searching for reassurance. Thomas smiled, his hand resting on its back. "Go on," he murmured. "This is your home." Clover chirped softly, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Then, with a tentative hop, it ventured into the grass, its tiny paws skimming over the ground. Thomas watched as it moved farther away, his chest tightening with each step. But then Clover stopped. It turned back to look at him, its dark eyes filled with something unspoken. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, the connection between them unbroken. And then, Clover chirped one last time, a soft, melodic sound that carried across the meadow. It was a goodbye and a thank you and a promise all at once. Thomas smiled through the tears that blurred his vision, his heart aching and full all at once. "Goodbye, Clover," he whispered. "Be free." He stood there for a long time, watching as Clover disappeared into the meadow, its small form blending into the wildflowers. The meadow felt quieter without the rabbit's presence, but Thomas knew he had made the right choice. Clover was where it was meant to be. As he turned to head back to the cottage, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. The bond he had shared with Clover would never be broken, no matter where life took them. And in his heart, he knew that the little rabbit would always carry a piece of him, just as he would carry a piece of Clover. Thomas spent the next few weeks carrying Clover's memory with him, though it wasn't always sadness that accompanied it. There was something about the experience that had awakened a part of him he hadn't realized was dormant, a part that found joy in the small, fleeting moments of connection with the world around him. The meadow, once a backdrop to his routine, now felt alive with possibility. Every blade of grass, every rustle in the wind, seemed to carry a whisper of Clover's spirit. Thomas found himself noticing things he hadn't before. The way the dew clung to the leaves in the early morning light, the gentle hum of bees as they flitted from flower to flower, the intricate patterns woven into the bark of the trees. It was as if Clover had left behind a lens through which Thomas could see the world with fresh eyes. One bright spring morning, as Thomas walked the familiar trail through the meadow, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something unseen was guiding his steps. He carried a small bundle of fresh greens in his satchel, lettuce leaves, carrot tops, and a handful of clover he had picked from the garden. It had become a habit of his, leaving small offerings at the edge of the forest in the hopes that Clover might find them. The air was crisp and fragrant, the sun casting dappled patterns on the ground as it filtered through the trees. Thomas reached the clearing where he always left the greens, kneeling to arrange them neatly on a flat rock. As he worked, he spoke softly, his words carried by the gentle breeze. "Wherever you are, I hope you're happy," he murmured. "And I hope you know I'm proud of you." He sat back on his heels, his gaze sweeping over the clearing. It was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant trill of a bird. Thomas let out a soft sigh, his thoughts drifting to the many moments he had shared with Clover. "You taught me a lot, you know," he said, his voice tinged with warmth, "about trust and patience and what it means to care for someone outside of yourself." The words hung in the air, unspoken truths that felt lighter once released. As Thomas rose to his feet, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned, his breath catching as he saw a small rabbit emerging from the underbrush. His heart leapt, hope surging through him like a wave. Could it be Clover? But as the rabbit moved closer, he realized it wasn't. Its fur was a soft gray, its ears slightly shorter than Clover's had been. Still, it approached with the same tentative curiosity, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Thomas crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hello there," he said softly, his voice soothing. The rabbit paused a few feet away, its dark eyes watching him intently. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the connection between them unspoken but undeniable. The rabbit chirped softly, its small body quivering as it took another step closer. Thomas smiled, reaching into his satchel to pull out a sprig of clover. He held it out, his hand steady as the rabbit inched forward. "You're braver than you look," he said with a chuckle. The rabbit sniffed the clover before taking it gingerly between its teeth. It chewed slowly, its eyes never leaving Thomas's. In that moment, Thomas felt a sense of peace wash over him, a quiet affirmation that the bond he had shared with Clover was still alive in the world around him. "You remind me of someone," he said softly, his smile tinged with bittersweet warmth. The encounter stayed with Thomas long after the rabbit had darted back into the underbrush. It wasn't Clover, but it felt like a message, a reminder that the connections we make, no matter how fleeting, leave an imprint that can be felt long after they're gone. Thomas returned to the clearing often, leaving small offerings of greens and watching for signs of life. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of a rabbit darting through the grass, or hear the faint rustle of movement in the bushes. Each time, his heart swelled with a mix of hope and gratitude, the memory of Clover a constant presence in his mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the meadow was bathed in golden light, Thomas sat on the porch with a sketchpad in his lap. He had taken to drawing lately, capturing the beauty of the meadow and the creatures that called it home. It was a way of honoring Clover's memory, of keeping their connection alive. His pencil moved across the page with practiced ease, the lines and shadows taking shape beneath his hand. He wasn't an artist by any means, but there was something cathartic about putting his thoughts and feelings onto paper. As he worked, the image of Clover began to emerge, a small, delicate figure surrounded by wildflowers, its wide eyes filled with the quiet determination that had always defined it. Thomas smiled as he added the finishing touches, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and longing. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was a reflection of the bond they had shared, a bond that would never fade, no matter how much time passed. "You're still with me," he murmured, his voice soft. "In every way that matters." The seasons shifted once more, and summer arrived in full bloom. The meadow came alive with vibrant colors and the hum of insects, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers. Thomas found himself spending more time outside, soaking in the warmth and vitality of the world around him. Though Clover was no longer by his side, the little rabbit's presence seemed to linger in the meadow, woven into the fabric of the place they had shared. One morning, as the golden light of dawn spilled across the horizon, Thomas set out on a walk through the meadow. He carried his sketchpad under one arm, a small bundle of greens tucked into his satchel. The routine had become second nature to him, a way to feel close to Clover and to honor the bond they had shared. The trail was quiet, the only sounds the soft crunch of his boots on the earth and the distant trill of birdsong. Thomas paused near the clearing where he always left his offerings, kneeling to arrange the greens on the flat rock. As he worked, he spoke softly, his words carried by the gentle breeze. "Wherever you are, I hope you're happy," he murmured. "And I hope you know I think about you every day." He sat back on his heels, his gaze sweeping over the clearing. It was a ritual he had come to cherish, a moment of connection that brought him both comfort and peace. The meadow felt alive with possibility, every rustle in the grass or flicker of movement a reminder of the life that thrived here. As he rose to his feet, Thomas caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, his breath catching as he saw a small rabbit emerging from the underbrush. It wasn't Clover, he knew that much, but there was something about its wide eyes and cautious movements that tugged at his heart. "Hello there," he said softly, crouching down to meet the rabbit's gaze. The little creature paused, its nose twitching as it regarded him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Thomas reached into his satchel, pulling out a sprig of clover. He held it out, his hand steady as the rabbit inched closer. "You're safe here," he said, his voice warm and inviting. The rabbit sniffed the clover before taking it gingerly between its teeth. Thomas smiled, his chest swelling with a quiet sense of joy. It wasn't Clover, but it was a reminder that the bond he had shared with the little rabbit had left an imprint on his heart. That evening, Thomas sat on the porch, his sketchpad balanced on his knees. The image of the rabbit lingered in his mind, its delicate features and cautious movements etched into his memory. He let his pencil move across the page, capturing the moment with careful strokes. The act of drawing had become a form of meditation for him, a way to process his thoughts and emotions. As he worked, the sounds of the meadow filled the air, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of an owl. Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him, the weight of the day's events giving way to a quiet contentment. When he finished the drawing, he sat back to admire his work. The rabbit's form was delicate and precise, its wide eyes filled with a quiet strength that mirrored Clover's. Thomas smiled faintly, his fingers brushing over the lines of the sketch. "You've got company out there," he murmured, his voice soft, "and you'll always have me." The next morning, Thomas awoke to the sound of soft rustling outside his window. He blinked sleepily, the early light of dawn casting a warm glow across the room. Rising from his bed, he moved to the window and peered outside. To his surprise, a small rabbit sat near the edge of the garden, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It wasn't the same one he had seen the day before, but it carried the same cautious curiosity, its tiny body quivering with each movement. Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with affection. "Looks like word's getting out," he said with a chuckle. He stepped outside, moving slowly so as not to startle the rabbit. It watched him with wide eyes, its body tense but unmoving as he approached. Thomas crouched down, his hand outstretched. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The rabbit chirped softly, its nose twitching as it inched closer. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of carrot he had brought with him. The rabbit sniffed it cautiously before taking it between its teeth, its movements quick and delicate. Thomas watched with a smile, his chest filling with a sense of connection. It wasn't Clover, but it was a reminder of the bond he had shared with the little rabbit, a bond that had left an indelible mark on his heart. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to notice more rabbits appearing near the cottage. They would dart through the garden, nibbling on the greens he left out for them, their tiny bodies a blur of movement. Each one carried a piece of Clover's spirit, a reminder of the life and resilience that thrived in the meadow. Thomas found himself feeling less alone, the presence of the rabbits filling the quiet spaces of his life. They were a testament to the connection he had shared with Clover, a bond that had grown and expanded in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the rabbits dart through the grass, he felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. Clover had given him more than he could have ever imagined: hope, connection, and a renewed sense of purpose. "You've left your mark," he murmured, his voice filled with warmth. "And it's one I'll carry with me forever." Summer melted into autumn, painting the meadow in warm hues of gold, amber, and crimson. The rabbits that now frequented Thomas's garden became a familiar sight, their playful movements and quiet presence filling the air with a sense of life and renewal. Though Clover had been the first, it was clear that the bond Thomas had formed with the little rabbit had rippled outward, connecting him to the natural world in a way he had never experienced before. One particular morning, as the leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Thomas decided to take his sketchpad and head deeper into the forest than he ever had before. The rabbits had shown him that life existed in abundance just beyond his usual paths, and he felt a quiet pull to explore further. The forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Thomas walked slowly, his boots crunching against the fallen foliage as he took in the beauty around him. He paused every so often to sketch: a cluster of mushrooms growing at the base of a tree, a squirrel darting across a branch, the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy above. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that sank deep into his bones and made him feel truly alive. And yet, as he walked, he couldn't help but feel a faint tug of longing. Clover had been such a central part of his life, and though the other rabbits brought him joy, none could replace the unique bond he had shared with the little creature who had trusted him so completely. As he rounded a bend in the trail, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement among the underbrush. Thomas froze, his heart quickening as he scanned the forest floor. At first, he thought it might be one of the rabbits from his garden, but as the figure emerged, his breath caught in his throat. It was Clover. The little rabbit's fur was glossy and well-groomed, its body stronger and more confident than when he had last seen it. But there was no mistaking the wide, dark eyes that met his, filled with the same quiet determination that had always defined it. "Clover," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The rabbit paused, its nose twitching as it regarded him with an almost curious expression. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the connection between them as strong as it had ever been. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening with a mix of joy and disbelief. "You came back," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Clover chirped, a soft, melodic sound that carried across the clearing. It was a sound Thomas hadn't realized he had missed until now, a reminder of the many quiet conversations they had shared. He crouched down slowly, his hand outstretched as he called out to the little rabbit. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm still here." To his amazement, Clover hopped closer, its movements confident and unhurried. Thomas's heart swelled as the rabbit stopped just a few feet away, its wide eyes meeting his. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against Clover's soft fur. "You're doing so well," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I knew you would." Clover nuzzled his hand briefly before hopping a few steps back, its body low to the ground as if inviting him to follow. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then rose to his feet, his sketchpad tucked under one arm as he trailed after the rabbit. Clover led him deeper into the forest, weaving through the trees with a sense of purpose. Thomas followed, his heart pounding as he wondered where the little rabbit was taking him. The forest grew denser, the canopy above blocking out much of the sunlight. But Clover moved with confidence, its path clear and deliberate. Eventually, they emerged into a small clearing bathed in golden light. The ground was covered in soft moss, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers. At the center of the clearing was a small warren, its entrances marked by patches of freshly dug earth. Thomas's breath caught as he saw them. Other rabbits, darting in and out of the warren with playful energy. There were at least half a dozen, their sleek forms moving through the clearing like shadows. And among them was Clover, its small frame unmistakable as it joined the others. The sight filled Thomas with a profound sense of awe. Clover had found a place where it truly belonged, a community where it could thrive. And yet, the little rabbit had brought him here, as if to show him that their bond hadn't been broken. It had simply evolved. "You wanted me to see this," Thomas said softly, his voice filled with wonder. Clover chirped in response, its wide eyes meeting his briefly before it darted into the warren. Thomas stood there for a long moment, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. This was where Clover was meant to be, and he was honored to have played a small part in its journey. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, Thomas turned to leave. He knew Clover wouldn't follow him this time, and that was okay. The little rabbit had shown him something beautiful, a reminder that connections, no matter how fleeting, leave a lasting impact. When he returned to the cottage that evening, the air felt lighter, the silence less heavy. Thomas sat on the porch with his sketchpad, his pencil moving across the page as he captured the image of the clearing and the rabbits that had made it their home. It was a way of keeping the memory alive, a tribute to the bond that had changed him in so many ways. As he worked, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. Clover might have returned to the wild, but their connection would always remain, a thread woven into the fabric of his life, reminding him of the power of trust, resilience, and love. "You're where you're meant to be," Thomas murmured, his voice soft. "And so am I," and for the first time in a long while he felt whole.